Hello ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the end of the week analysis. It's July 27th and it is a wonderful Friday. A lot of great opportunities trading this week. I hope that you guys were profitable in your trading this week because I think there's a lot of great technical setups, and if you were, I hope that I was able to be a part of that because I really just enjoyed this trading week. A lot of really good confirmation signals, trend line bounces that followed through nicely. So for me, this was a really good week of trading, and I hope that you were able to take advantage of it as well. And again, I hope that I was able to maybe help you take advantage of it in some way. Today, we're just going to go over the weekly charts pretty quickly, kind of get an overview before we jump into trading Monday. And there's a few things that I'm looking at, and maybe some long-term opportunities in my mind that I'd like to share with you. Before we do that, as always, we want to go over our terms here. So let me pull those over for you. There you go. A little small, but you can pause the video and stuff if you need to read those. Obviously, the moral of the terms is that it's for educational purposes only, and we're not licensed or registered to provide investment advice. Okay? Alright, so with that said, let's go ahead and jump right into our daily review, or in this case, weekly review. Now, the first thing that I'm going to look at is the US dollar yen, and the reason is because the US yen has been somewhat interesting in its weekly dynamic, because for me, it seems like each week it is somewhat I don't know, channeling, I guess. It seems like each week I look at the USD yen and I don't see a lot of definite movement in it. But when you look at the weekly chart, aside from this portion before March, there's actually been some serious definite moving on a weekly chart, which means that obviously the daily, if the weekly looks like that, obviously the daily was moving quite a bit more. Sometimes you just need to take a step back and look at the weekly and kind of find that direction. And so what we see on the weekly for the US yen is obviously a high point here where the momentum certainly switched to the bearish side and followed through pretty nicely, as you can see here. We had a 2-week rally with a bearish bar in between that peaked up and then turned back down to show continuation of the trend. So, just looking at this kind of shape here, it looks like great bearish continuation. However, there's still this somewhat up, resistance area. I guess it's not really a trend, but it's still intact because once we got down to the price around here, which is like the 77.7 price, we had a pretty significant bounce, and it ended up being actually a bullish week. So for me, that's kind of leading me towards believing that we're going to get a rally and maybe keep this little small uptrend in place, and that next week's week could very possibly be a bullish week, which is not what I was expecting going into the week. So the USD yen definitely showing some interesting signs of trying to rally, and I'm really curious to see how that's going to follow through, obviously during next week's trading. And so I'd keep an eye on that, even though I think that the yen might maintain more strength across the board than any other currency, except for AUD in New Zealand perhaps. It looks like the US might be rallying against it. So that's something to keep your eye out during the next week of trading. Let's check out the euro dollar. Alright, when we look at the euro dollar, we see that today it's slightly retraced back down. Now, when we look at the euro dollar, we see that obviously this week was a bullish week, but there's not a lot of authority in that, considering how much we have of a downtrend since 2007 or whenever we peaked up here. So a lot of downward momentum, and it's hard to be confident in any kind of long setup when this is what you're looking at. Now, with that said, if we do see some continuation and maybe we break this step, we bounce off it, we continue, then all of a sudden you're in the position to look for longs. Because if you look at like a rally like this in the upward direction, sure, it's not a real long uptrend in the scope of the downtrend, but there's a lot of pips to be made there, and there's nothing wrong with taking advantage of that. So this could provide us with an opportunity like that, and if we get some follow through, especially through this little level here as the first major level that it would need to break on the way up, there could definitely be some legitimate long opportunities, and I wouldn't be opposed to taking them. All right, let's look at the pound dollar, because the pound dollar is a pair that I have kind of been off and on with. Let me pull this over here so you can see it. The pound dollar has been maybe a little bit tricky for me, because I've kind of determined which direction it was going to go in relatively accurately as of late, but somehow just kind of missed out on some trades because it's been a little more whippy than I'd like to see. So, for instance, trying to get long on down here was a good trader idea, but the whip to the downside just lasted a little bit longer than I expected, stopped me out, and I missed the move on the way back up. So, because, obviously when you have this kind of pattern that we see here in pound, that's a little more difficult to trade than the pattern like this that we see on the euro dollar. Now, with that said, there's obviously still a lot of pivots to be made in these swings from high to low like that, but you just got to be a little more accurate, I'd say, in your trading. Now, we do have a pretty consistent downward channel here that I think is worth trading, and that there's good setups to be found in. But again, you got to be very specific and very exact with your entries, because the pound dollar moves a lot already, and when it's in some type of channeling area, that increases the whip. So that makes it all the more difficult for the trader to be exact and get in at the right location. And another thing that we have, not only this channel, but obviously this major support zone down here that the pound dollar has had no success breaking in the past several years. So that's something that you can also play off. And then, of course, recently we do have this upward trend line building. It looks a little more long-term when you're looking at the daily chart, and then you realize it's only been a few weeks when you're looking at the weekly. But still, definitely looks to be bouncing off there. And then we have a little bit of a top base here that's trying to break now. But I would expect it to get back up here. But again, the issue with trading, especially when you're trading a pair like the pound dollar and how it's acting now, is that you might think that it's going to go up and get to this line, and you might be exactly right, and you still end up losing money, because even though you went long and it did go up, it just stopped you out before it went there. And so that's kind of one of the things that makes trading difficult, especially because we don't know how many times it's going to bounce off this line before it gets up here. It might glide the whole way along instead of taking full bounces, because a lot of times you can have a trend line like this. Okay, so here's your trend line, and there's two different ways for it to ride the trend line. It could ride the trend line like this, where it's chopping back and forth and heading up, or you could have a trend line where it's up like this, and instead you're getting these big moves up, and then moves back down, then a higher high, and then moves back down, then a higher high. So you have different types of trend lines. Both of them are very valid, but they react very differently on those trend lines. So in a kind of choppy channeling market, you're probably more likely to see a trend line where it's tighter to the trend line, kind of like we see a lot of red bars here in the middle of our blue bars on the way up. All right, so that's kind of one thing to note when you're trading a pair that's in a channeling action. All right, but pound dollar I think has a lot of movement, and I'm looking for it to come up here, on this rally as well. The question is, after it gets up here, is it finally going to break out of this triangle and start going up? Is it finally going to break out of this little triangle and go down? That, of course, I really don't know. But when it does, I think we'll have some great trade opportunities there as well. All right, let's look at the AUD dollar quickly. The Australian dollar is pretty similar to the pound dollar in the way it's been moving. However, I would say that Australia has a little more strength behind it than pound does. And of course, one thing to note is that where we saw those large bearish bars on the way up this uptrend, you don't see those on the AUD dollar. So, I mean, I feel pretty confident about Australian dollar longs. Unfortunately, I've really taken profit too early on my Australian dollar longs. But I'm thinking that we have somewhat of a little downward, if you count these points, not really very steep downtrend, but still, since 2007 or whatever it is, it's been moving overall down. However, I'm thinking that there's a pretty good possibility that on our most recent rally here, we're going to break out and maybe touch new highs, and that's going to be something that I'm really looking for. And if it does, if it does break out and touch these new highs in the 115 area, it's going to get really interesting as to what happens next. And so that's going to be something that I'm certainly watching for and going to be ready to react to. So keep an eye on that. Alright, let's see here. Alright, so if you want to talk about a trend, look at the euro pound. Now this thing has really moved straight down. This is a great trending pair right now, and it's interesting because it's euro versus the pound. Similar economies, and you'd expect this to be the choppiest market, but instead it's the most trending market. And so the euro pound is interesting just because the eurozone, because it has so many little countries in it, there's always one country's going under or whatever, so there's always this bad news pulling it down. Where Great Britain really is in probably just as bad a shape as most of the euro nations. But because there's not Spain and Portugal crying out for bankruptcy, you don't see as much constant bad news pulling it down. And so that's probably one thing that's really affected the euro pound as a pair, and why the pound's been so much stronger than the euro over the past few years. And so with the euro pound, you can scroll back and see that we're at pretty low lows here. I can scroll back and show you that it's been, let's see, what are we at here? Is that 6 years? 6 years since we've been at these lows, and so it really is headed down at quite an impressive rate, and I think that is probably going to continue because with a bad kind of global economy, you're looking at a zone. Obviously the eurozone is a zone. There's always going to be one country or another that's crying out for bankruptcy or doing whatever and pulling the rest of the economies down with it. And so that's just something that the eurozone is going to have to deal with, and something that's probably going to continue to provide a lot more bad news for the eurozone than other currencies. And leads me to believe this trend is going to continue. So with that said, I think if you're a long-term trader looking for weekly shorts like a short up here, a retrace, and then a short up here, engulfing bar down here, a retrace here, and then a short entry there, some topping tails and a short entry here. All of those short entries are going to be awesome long-term entries that you can hold for thousands of pips if you get in at a good place and have the patience to hold it. And so that's what a good trend can offer you, and something that we should definitely take note of and then take advantage of as well. Alright, so that's my last pair that I wanted to cover on the weekly chart, and just wanted to give you kind of a weekly overview of what I'm looking at. AUD and pound are somewhat sideways markets, but with good rallies in between, a lot of pips to be found there. Euro dollar and euro pound are more trending markets that are always making attempts to rally up, but seem to be being pushed down to the overall bearish trend each and every month. So keep your eye on both of those different kind of scenarios that we have. Trade those trending markets for what they're worth, and get on board on those rallies in the more sideways markets for what they're worth as well. And hopefully you'll be able to take advantage of those and make a lot of money doing it. Alright, well, thanks for watching the analysis. Hopefully this will give you somewhat of a guide to look at next week and to improve your trading. I enjoy being with you guys today, and I'll talk to you very soon.